The rain had been falling since morning, and Ada Cooper was up on her own roof with a hammer she barely knew how to hold, because there was nobody left in the world who was going to do it for her. It was the autumn of 1874, and the town of Millhaven, Kansas sat low and weather-beaten on the edge of the open prairie, the kind of place where the wind never quite stopped talking and the sky changed its mind 3 times before noon. The homesteads along the eastern ridge were modest and hard-won, each one a testament to the stubbornness of the people who had dragged their lives out here from places softer and kinder. Ada's place was one of them, a one-story timber house with a front porch that listed slightly to the left, a vegetable garden that she kept with religious dedication, and a roof that had been threatening to give way since June. Her husband, Thomas Cooper, had promised to fix it before the fall rains came. Thomas had promised a great many things before he rode out in March and caught the fever that came up off the river bottoms and killed a man in 4 days if it wanted to. He had been 31 years old. Ada had been 28, their daughter Ellie had been 5, and the roof had not been fixed. Ada had spent the month since Thomas died learning which of his promises she could let go of, and which ones would kill her if she ignored them. The roof was the latter. She had watched the stain on the bedroom ceiling spread like a slow bruise through July and August, and when September brought rain that slanted sideways off the plains, she had put buckets under 3 separate drips and gone to sleep listening to the irregular music of water in tin. She could not afford the lumber mill's repair fee. She had asked around, quietly, with the pride of a woman who hated asking for anything, and the men in town were sympathetic in the way men are when they mean to help but have not yet figured out when. The Hendersons across the way had their own troubles. Old Cal Briggs had a bad back and could not climb. The preacher said he would pray on it. And so Ada had found herself at the mercantile buying a box of nails and a jar of tar compound and a roll of oilcloth. And she had decided that if nobody was going to help her, then she was going to help herself. This was how she ended up on the roof of her house at 10:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, in the rain, in a man's work coat that had been Thomas's and that still smelled faintly of him when it was dry but not when it was wet, on her knees on shingles that were slick and treacherous, with a hammer that kept sliding in her grip and nails that the wind kept sending sideways. She had gotten 3 nails into a warped shingle when she heard the horse. She did not look up right away. Horses came and went on the road below the ridge all the time, drovers, merchants, travelers passing through on their way to Dodge or Wichita or anywhere that was not Millhaven. She pressed another nail to the wood and struck it once, twice, a third time that glanced off the head and cracked her knuckle through the wet leather of her glove. She swore, quietly, which she only allowed herself to do when Ellie was not within earshot. Ellie was at school. Ada sucked her knuckle through the glove and pressed the nail again, squinting against the rain. The horse had stopped. She looked down then and saw a man standing in the road below her yard, the reins of a dun-colored horse loose in one hand, his hat pulled low against the rain. He was tall and lean in that way the prairie made men, where the wind and the work stripped everything unnecessary away and left only the essential parts. His coat was the color of old saddle leather, dark now with rain. He was looking up at her with an expression that she could not read from that distance, but which did not appear to be the expression of a man who was merely passing through. She did not recognize him. That was notable in Millhaven, which was small enough that Ada knew every face in it and half the faces within 20 miles. This man was a stranger. She turned back to her roof and struck the nail 3 more times, getting it flush with a grim satisfaction. She could feel him still standing there. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. She reached for the next shingle and the wind chose that exact moment to gust hard off the prairie, and the oilcloth she had been holding in place with her knee lifted and snapped, and she lunged for it and her boot slid on the wet shingle. And for one terrible, stomach-dropping moment, she was almost not on the roof anymore. She caught herself on the ridge beam, both arms wrapped around it, the hammer dangling from its loop around her wrist, her heart slamming in her chest with a violence that surprised even her. "Ma'am!" The voice came from just below her. She turned her head and the man was there, standing on her porch railing which he had apparently climbed without her noticing, his hands braced on the edge of the roof. Up close he was younger than she had thought, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, with a jaw dark with a few days of beard and eyes that were a steady, serious gray. There was a scar at the edge of his left eyebrow, thin and silver. "You need to move back from the edge," he said. He said it the way someone says a thing they are certain of, without heat or alarm, just plain and level. Ada's heart was still going at a considerable pace. She said, "I am perfectly fine." "You almost went off the side," he said. "But I did not," she said, "and I do not know who you are." "Luke Redmond," he said, as if this settled the matter of whether she should trust him with her roof. He glanced at the shingles, at the tar compound, at the nails scattered across the wet surface. He looked at the hammer still swinging from her wrist. He looked at her hand, the one she had cracked her knuckle on, which was beginning to show purple through the glove. "Let me do this," he said. "I did not ask you," Ada said. "No," he said. "You did not." He swung himself up onto the roof with an ease that suggested he had climbed more dangerous things in worse conditions, and he crouched beside her in the rain and held out one hand for the hammer. Ada Cooper looked at this man, this stranger named Luke Redmond, who had ridden up on a dun horse and climbed her porch railing, and was now sitting on her roof in the rain as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do, and she thought about telling him to get down. She thought about it seriously. She was a woman who had survived the last 7 months on stubbornness, and she was not in the habit of accepting help from people she had not invited. But her knuckle hurt, and the rain was getting heavier, and there were at least 8 more bad shingles she had counted from the ground and only managed to reach 3 from up here, and Ellie would be home from school in 4 hours, and Ada wanted to have the roof done by then, and this man was already here. She handed him the hammer. He did not say anything about it. He did not say thank you or nod or smile. He just took the hammer and moved to the first problem shingle and began to work with a practiced, efficient competence that made Ada feel a complicated mixture of relief and irritation, because it was relief she would have preferred not to need. She held the oilcloth. She passed him nails. She watched him work his way across the roof with the steady patience of a man who has nothing to prove and does not feel the need to prove it anyway. The rain fell. The hammer rang. The oilcloth snapped in the wind and they both grabbed for it at the same moment and their hands collided and they both pulled back and said nothing about it. An hour passed. Then another. He did not come down until it was done. Ada climbed down first, using the ladder she had propped against the porch before she climbed up, because the porch railing seemed a less dignified method. She stood on the porch and watched Luke Redmond come down from the roof the same way he had gone up over the edge, hands on the railing, dropping to the porch boards with the loose ease of a man who trusted his own body. He landed lightly and straightened and handed her the hammer. "The east corner is going to need new boards come spring," he said, "but it will hold the winter." "Thank you," Ada said. She said it stiffly, but she said it. He nodded. Water ran from the brim of his hat. He looked out at the yard, at the horse still standing patiently in the road, and he seemed to be preparing to leave. Ada had not survived 7 months of widowhood by being careless about her own safety, and she was acutely aware that she knew nothing about this man except his name, and the fact that he was competent with a hammer. But she was also the daughter of a woman who had believed that basic human courtesy was one of the few things that distinguished civilization from the alternative, and she said, "I have coffee on the stove. It is the least I can do." He looked at her then, and the gray eyes held something that was not quite surprise but was close to it. "You do not have to," he said. "I know that," Ada said, and opened the door. He tied his horse to the post at the end of the porch and came inside. The house was small but clean and warm, the kind of clean that requires constant effort and the kind of warmth that comes from a cast iron stove well managed. There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table and a braided rug on the floor and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam and a child's drawing pinned to the wall near the window. A house, a woman with yellow hair, a yellow sun overhead. Luke Redmond stood just inside the door as if he was not sure he had been given permission to go further, and Ada took his wet coat and hung it on the hook beside Thomas's coat without thinking about it, and then felt the slight wrongness of that and moved past it, because there was nothing to be done. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. He took his hat off and set it on the table, and she saw his hair was dark, pushed flat by the hat, and there was a patience in the way he sat that was different from stillness. It was more like a man who had learned to be quiet in himself and found it more comfortable than noise. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table and sat across from him and picked hers up with both hands because her knuckles still ached. "You are passing through," she said. "Was," he said. He looked at the coffee. "I have been looking for work." "What kind of work?" "Whatever kind needs doing," he said. "I can shoe a horse or mend a fence or drive cattle. I worked 3 years with a trail crew out of Texas. Before that I was a ranch hand in Colorado." "What brings you to Millhaven?" He seemed to consider how much of this to offer, and then he said simply, "I needed a different direction for a while." He said it without self-pity and without drama, and it landed with the weight of a thing that was true and was going to stay true whether it was understood or not. Ada looked at him across the table. He was not a beautiful man in the way that some men are beautiful, all smooth angles and easy confidence. He was a man who looked as though he had been used by the world and had used it back in equal measure, and who had come through that negotiation without bitterness, which was rarer than it sounded. "Sam Elbert might have work," she said. "He has the largest spread north of town. He loses hands every fall to men going south for the winter." "I will ask him," Luke said. "His wife is Nora Elbert," Ada said. "If you go to the house and ask for her first, she is more likely to say yes to you than he is. Sam is cautious about strangers. Nora is a better judge of character." Luke looked at her steadily. "Is that your assessment of me? Good character?" Ada met his gaze. "You climbed up on a stranger's roof in the rain and worked 2 hours without being asked," she said. "Either you have good character or you are after something, and I have nothing worth being after, so I am inclined toward the former." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "You are very direct," he said. "It saves time," Ada said. They sat with their coffee for another few minutes, and the rain drummed on the roof that would now hold, and the stove clicked and settled, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have no reason to perform for each other. "I am sorry for your loss," he said before he stood to go. She looked at him. "You are wearing your husband's coat," he said, not unkindly. "The initials on the inside collar." Ada had forgotten, entirely, that TC was stitched into the lining in her mother-in-law's careful needlework. She felt the old familiar press of grief in her chest, not sharp the way it had been in the first weeks but still present, like a stone she carried and had become accustomed to but not reconciled to. "Thank you," she said. "How long?" he asked. 7 months. He nodded. He did not say it would get easier or that Thomas was in a better place or any of the things that people said to her that she was tired of. He just nodded, and that was better than all of it. He took his coat and his hat and went to the door, and then he paused and turned. "Is there anything else on the property that needs seeing to?" he said. Ada blinked. "That is a large question." "I have time," he said, "if you have need." She thought about the fence post on the south side of the garden that had been leaning since August. She thought about the hinges on the barn door that sang terribly in the cold. She thought about the split in the 3rd porch step that she kept meaning to fill before someone's foot went through it. "The porch step," she said, finally. "The 3rd one from the bottom. There is a split in it." He looked down at his feet where he was standing on the porch. He counted. He lifted his boot from the 3rd step and pressed it down, and it gave slightly under his weight with a sound that was definitely not good. He crouched and looked at it. "I would need a board and some wood screws," he said. "The mercantile carry hardware." "Mr. Finch carries most things," Ada said. "I will see about it," he said. "You do not have to," she said, which was what she always said. "I know that," he said, which was what he always said she would come to find. He went down the steps and untied his horse and rode into town, and Ada stood on the porch in the clearing rain and watched him go and felt something she had not felt in 7 months, which was not precisely hope but was perhaps the direction of it. He came back at 3 in the afternoon with a plank of yellow pine and a paper sack of wood screws and a borrowed brace and bit from Finch's mercantile, and he fixed the 3rd step while Ada made a pot of vegetable soup for supper. And he was just finishing the 2nd screw when the school road produced a small tornado in a blue dress and 2 dark braids who came up the yard at speed. Ellie Cooper stopped at the gate when she saw the strange man on her porch steps, and the caution in her small face was her mother's caution exactly. She was 5.5 years old and had brown eyes and her father's nose, and she was already the kind of person who assessed situations before entering them. "Who are you?" she called from the gate. "Luke Redmond," he said as he had said to Ada. "I am fixing your step." Ellie looked at the step. She looked at Luke. She came through the gate with the deliberate, measured pace of a child deciding to be brave. She climbed the 1st step and the 2nd step and stood at the repaired 3rd step and stepped on it hard. "It does not squeak," she announced. "No," Luke agreed. "It should not squeak any more." Ellie looked at him with the frank appraisal that children apply before they learn to be polite about it. "You have a scar," she said, pointing at the one above his eye. "Ellie," Ada said from the doorway. "I am only observing," Ellie said. "It is all right," Luke said. "I do have a scar. A horse objected to being shod and made its feelings clear." Ellie considered this. "Did it hurt?" "Very much," he said. She nodded, satisfied with the honesty of this answer, and went past him into the house to report to her mother on the events of her school day, and Luke gathered his tools and packed the extra screws back in the paper bag and stood on the repaired step looking at the door where Ellie had disappeared. Ada came out with the paper bag of leftover screws and handed it to him. "Stay for supper," she said, and then immediately felt that this was perhaps too much. But he said, "Thank you," and stayed. They sat at the table, the 3 of them, with soup and bread and the lamp lit against the early dark of October, and Ellie talked in the way that 5-year-olds talk when they have had a full day of experiences to report, which is without pause, and Luke listened to her the way that people listen when they are genuinely paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak, and Ada watched him listen and felt the stone in her chest shift slightly. Not go away. Just shift. After supper he helped Ada clear the table, which she had not asked him to do, and then he picked up his hat and said good night, and Ada walked him to the porch. "The Elbert place is 4 miles north on the post road," she said. "You cannot miss it. It is the only ranch with a painted gate." "I will ride out tomorrow," he said. He settled his hat on and looked at her in the lamplight from the window. "Mrs. Cooper." "Ada," she said, and she was not entirely sure why she said it, except that Mrs. Cooper was the name on Thomas's grave and she was trying, carefully and imperfectly, to still be herself. He looked at her for a moment. "Ada," he said, and the way he said it, plainly, without self-consciousness, made her feel, for a brief strange instant, like herself again. "Good night, Luke Redmond," she said. "Good night," he said, and went down the steps to his horse, and rode out into the dark of the Kansas night. She stood on the porch for a while after he was gone, listening to the prairie wind and the last few drips of rain from the eaves, and she thought about the roof that was now fixed, and the step that was now fixed, and the man who had come from nowhere and done both without being asked, and without making her feel as though she owed him a debt, which was a careful and difficult balance to strike, and he had struck it without apparent effort. Then she went inside and washed the supper dishes and put Ellie to bed and sat by the stove with her mending, and told herself very firmly that she was not thinking about gray eyes and a quiet voice, and the way a strange man had crouched in the rain on her roof for 2 hours and not said a word about the difficulty of it. She told herself this so firmly that she was almost convinced by the time she went to sleep. He went to the Elbert Ranch the next morning and came back the following afternoon with his horse and his saddlebags and a week's employment mucking stalls and mending fence, And he stopped at Ada's gate on his way to the bunkhouse and told her this. And she said she was glad to hear it, and he tipped his hat and rode on. He came by on Sunday, because the Elbert hands did not work Sunday, and he brought a small sack of dried apples from the general store, because Ellie had mentioned at supper that dried apples were her favorite thing. He left them at the gate when nobody answered his knock, and when Ada came back from the church with Ellie and found the sack hanging from the gatepost, she stood in the road for a moment looking at it, and Ellie said, "Is that from Luke?" And Ada said, "I expect so." And Ellie took the sack and shook it to hear the apples rustle and said, "He remembered." "He remembered," Ada agreed. The weeks that followed were the weeks of late autumn on the Kansas plains, which meant hard frosts in the mornings and wood to be split and animals to be winterized, and the garden to be put to bed for the season. Ada managed most of it herself, as she had managed most things since March, but Luke appeared on Sunday afternoons with a regularity that began to feel less like coincidence and more like intention, and each Sunday he found something that needed doing and did it. He split wood until there was enough stacked against the north side of the house to see them through to February. He banked the foundation of the root cellar with straw. He helped Ada bring in the last of the sweet potatoes and the dried bean pods and the turnips from the garden, working alongside her in the cold afternoon light while Ellie played in the yard and the sky went purple at the edges. They talked while they worked. Ada was surprised by how much she talked. She had grown quiet in the months after Thomas died, not from grief alone but from the particular loneliness of having no one who knew her well enough to be worth talking to. She had things inside her, opinions, observations, memories, small incidents from the daily work of keeping a homestead alive, that had been sitting unsaid for months. And Luke listened, and then he spoke, and he was someone worth talking to. He was from Missouri originally. A farm outside Independence. He had come west at 19, which was the age at which most men came west, when they were old enough to leave but not old enough to know what they were leaving for. He had worked cattle drives, 3 seasons on the Kishome Trail, brutal work that aged a man past his years but paid steadier than farming and suited him better, he said, because he had never minded solitude and long distances. He had been briefly married, he told her one Sunday afternoon and then corrected himself. He had been engaged to be married to a woman in Abilene named Catharine, and she had waited 2 seasons for him to come back from a drive and then married a merchant who did not leave every spring and came back changed every fall. He said this without bitterness and without sentimentality. He said it like a man reporting weather. "Do you regret it?" Ada said. They were sitting on the porch because the afternoon had turned briefly warm, the Indian summer weather that Kansas sent in October like an apology for what was coming. "I regret that she waited and I was not worth waiting for," he said. "I do not regret much else." Ada looked at her hands in her lap. "Thomas waited for me," she said. It came out sideways, not exactly what she meant. "I mean, I was the one who needed convincing. He asked me twice before I said yes." Luke looked at her. "Why did you need convincing?" "Because I was afraid of this," Ada said, and she meant the prairie and the distances and the hardness of it, but she also meant the grief, the open wound of losing someone to a place this unforgiving. Her mother had warned her. She had come anyway. She did not regret it either, even now, but the fear had been justified and she had been right to hesitate and wrong to let the hesitation make the choice for her, and both of those things were true at once. "And now," he said. "Now I know the fear was right," she said, "and I also know that being afraid of something does not protect you from it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it does not." Ellie came around the corner of the house with mud on her dress and a look of preemptive defiance on her face, and the conversation ended there. But Ada thought about it later after supper, when Ellie was asleep, and the house was quiet, and the wind moved through the grass outside. She thought about what it meant to know a thing was hard and choose it anyway. She thought about the difference between a second marriage and a second life, and whether those were the same thing or different things. She thought about Luke Redmond, who sat on her porch on Sunday afternoons and fixed her things and listened to her talk, and who was not Thomas and was not trying to be Thomas, and who had a quality she was still naming to herself, but which had something to do with constancy. The sense that he would be the same person tomorrow as he was today, that he would not promise what he could not deliver, that when he said he would do something, he would do it. In November, Nora Elbert invited Ada to a quilting evening at the ranch house, and Ada went, and Nora, who was the kind of woman who made friends with the efficiency of someone who understands how rare genuine friendship is, asked her about the man who had fixed her roof. "Sam says he is a good worker," Nora said, threading a needle with the precision of long practice. "Says he does not complain and does not cause trouble, which is more than can be said for most of the hands." "He seems a steady man," Ada said carefully. "He asks about you," Nora said, with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering exactly the right information at the right moment. Ada looked at her quilt square. "Does he?" "In a careful way," Nora said. "Not in the way of a man who is curious, in the way of a man who is concerned. He asked if you had enough wood put by. He asked if the roof had held in the last storm." "The roof held," Ada said. "I told him so," Nora said. He looked relieved. She pulled the thread through and tied it off and looked at Ada with the bright frankness of a woman who has been married 17 years and does not have time for indirection. "You could do worse, Ada." "I have not been widowed a year," Ada said. "I know that," Nora said. "I am not suggesting you do anything rash. I am suggesting that a good man who fixes things without being asked is not a common occurrence and worth noticing." "I have noticed," Ada said, very quietly. Nora smiled and said nothing more about it, which was a form of mercy. December came down on Millhaven with its full force, the wind off the plains cold enough to freeze the breath in your throat, the nights long and the sky enormous and full of stars that looked close enough to touch and were nowhere near it. Ada kept the stove going through the night and slept with Ellie in the big bed, because the child's warmth was practical as well as comforting. The wood Luke had stacked burned steady and clean, and she did not run short. He came on the Sunday before Christmas with a small carved horse in his coat pocket. He had made it himself, he said, from a piece of cottonwood he had found along the creek, and gave it to Ellie without ceremony, just set it on the table in front of her while she was eating her lunch. Ellie picked it up and turned it in her hands with the reverent attention she gave to things she loved immediately, and then she said, "It has a saddle," because he had carved a tiny saddle into the horse's back. "Every good horse needs a saddle," Luke said. Ellie set the horse carefully on the windowsill where the morning light would fall on it, and she could see it from the table, and then she climbed down from her chair and hugged Luke Redmond around the middle with the unself-conscious force of a child who has made a decision about a person and sees no reason to be modest about it. Luke went still for a moment, the way people go still when they are caught off guard by tenderness. His hand came up and rested briefly on the back of Ellie's head, just for a second, and then he straightened and Ellie went back to her lunch, and the moment passed. But Ada had seen it, and she held it in her chest like the warmth from the stove, and she did not examine it too closely for fear of what she would find. On Christmas Eve, a storm came off the north that froze the water in the pump and kept Ada from going to the church service she had planned on attending. She was not greatly troubled by this. She had provisions and wood and a child who was perfectly happy to spend the evening by the stove with her carved horse and a story. But she was alone in the particular way that Christmas makes people alone, with the memories of other Christmases pressing in, the smell of something Thomas used to cook, the weight of the space beside her in the bed. There was a knock at the door at 6 in the evening. She opened it and Luke was on the porch, snow on his shoulders and on his hat, holding a cloth-wrapped parcel and a lantern. "I rode by and your light was on," he said, which was the reason and also not the reason. Ada looked at him standing in the cold with the snow coming down behind him, and something broke open in her chest in a way that was not grief, or not only grief, but something else entirely, something that had been pressing against the walls of her for weeks now and was finally, stubbornly, asking to be named. "Come in," she said. He brought warmth in with him the way people do when they have come in from the cold, the contrast of it palpable. Ellie appeared from the bedroom in her nightgown and shrieked with delight and began immediately to tell him everything she had been saving up to tell him since Sunday. And Luke sat down at the table and listened, and Ada unwrapped the parcel and found a jar of Christmas oranges from the mercantile. A luxury item that she would not have bought for herself, and a length of blue wool fabric good quality, folded neatly. She looked at the fabric and then looked at him across the table where Ellie was still talking at full speed. "For a dress," he said simply. "You said in October you were wearing your last good wool to pieces." She had said that, in passing, while they were stacking beans. She had said it as an observation, not a request, and he had remembered it 2 months later and done something about it quietly, without announcement. Ada Cooper, who had held herself together through 7 months of widowhood with a rigid and necessary self-possession, felt the pressure behind her eyes that meant she was close to tears, and she was not going to cry in front of her daughter, and this man she was not sure what to call. So she pressed her lips together and folded the fabric carefully and said, "Thank you, Luke. That is very thoughtful." He nodded and looked at the table. Ellie eventually went to bed, reluctantly, with her carved horse tucked against her chest, and Luke and Ada sat by the stove with the lamp low between them and a pot of tea that Ada made because there was no coffee left in the house until she could get to the mercantile. And outside the snow fell and the wind moved through the eaves and Millhaven lay quiet under a white December sky. "You should not ride back in this," Ada said. "The road will be drifted." "I have ridden worse," he said. "I have no doubt," she said. "But there is no reason to." He looked at her. There was a question in the look, carefully restrained, asking for definition without pressing for it. "The barn is warm," she said. "There is a straw pile in the second stall. It would be irresponsible to put a horse on that road tonight." A smile came then, the first real one she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, broke through the careful quiet of it like sun through clouds, warm and sudden, and making her feel obscurely that she had been given something valuable. "All right," he said. "Thank you." He banked her stove for her before he went to the barn, adding wood in the careful way that meant the fire would hold through the night, and he said good night at the door and went out through the snow, and Ada stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, and her heart doing something complicated and fast. She slept. In the morning the snow had stopped and the sky was the particular brilliant blue that follows a plain snowstorm, the world remade and clean. She found a note on the porch under a stone when she went out to bring in wood. He had done that too, brought in the wood from the stack before leaving a note in a plain, careful hand that said, "The pump will need hot water to thaw. I got it going before I left. Merry Christmas." She stood on the porch in the cold blue morning with the note in her hand and Ellie's voice coming from inside asking about breakfast, and she thought, "I am in love with him." She thought it with the certainty of something known for a while that has finally been admitted. It did not feel like a revelation so much as a reckoning, the acknowledgement of a thing already true, already growing, already woven into the fabric of these past months. She was also afraid of it, in the way she had been afraid before Thomas, in the way she had described to Luke on the porch, knowing the fear was warranted and knowing it did not protect her. There was Ellie to consider. There was the matter of a year not yet passed since Thomas's death, and what that meant, and what people in Millhaven would say. There was the unknown quantity of what Luke felt, which she suspected but did not know. She went inside and made breakfast and said nothing. January in Kansas was a full-scale attempt on the part of the weather to drive every living thing south, and it very nearly succeeded. The cold was serious and structural, and had to be managed with constant attention. Ada was good at it. She had been doing it since her first winter here, 5 years ago, when she and Thomas had nearly frozen to death before they figured out how to bank a fire properly. But it was relentless work, and Ellie caught a cold in mid-January that settled in her chest and kept her in bed for 10 days, and had Ada awake at 3 in the morning listening to the ragged edge of her daughter's breathing with a fear so large it blotted out everything else. Luke came on the second Sunday of January and found Ada at the kitchen table with dark circles under her eyes and a pot of medicine tea steaming on the stove and Ellie in the bed in the other room, and he took one look at Ada's face and said, "Go sleep. I will sit with her." "You do not have to," Ada started. "I know that," he said. "Go." She slept for 6 hours, the first solid sleep she had had in days, and she woke to find Luke sitting in the chair beside Ellie's bed with her small hand in his large one and Ellie asleep and breathing more easily, and a pot of fresh tea on the stove, and the fire banked and burning clean. She stood in the doorway looking at this man sitting in the chair her husband used to sit in the room where her daughter slept, in the house that she had built with Thomas and was keeping alive alone, and the love she had admitted to herself on Christmas morning was no longer a quiet thing. It was loud and present and entirely certain. She said his name just softly, "Luke." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it had to be said sometime, and she was not a woman who could hold a thing like this at arm's length indefinitely, she said, "I need to tell you something." He set Ellie's hand gently down on the quilt and stood and followed her to the kitchen and stood across the table from her and waited. "I think I have been unfair to you," Ada said. "All these months, letting you come here, letting you help, She stopped. She looked at him directly because she was not capable of looking away from things. "I have feelings for you that I am not sure I had permission to develop yet. Thomas has been gone 10 months. I have a child. You have your own," she made a gesture, "your own life, and I do not know what this is or what you want from it, and I am aware that I may have entirely misread the situation, in which case please tell me so." Luke Redmond stood on the other side of the kitchen table and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Ada, I rode past your house the day I came to Millhaven because I saw you on the roof in the rain and I thought—" He paused, looking for words, which she had noticed he did carefully, not using them unless he had the right ones. "I thought you were the most determined person I had ever seen, and the loneliest." Ada said nothing. "I have been coming back every Sunday," he said, "because I want to be here. Because there is nowhere I would rather be on a Sunday afternoon than on your porch or at your table or helping with whatever you will let me help with. Because your daughter thinks I am worth hugging and you trust me enough to sleep while I sit with her, and those are the most valuable things anyone has offered me in a long time." His voice was steady throughout, but there was something in it, at the end, that was not quite steady, a small break in the evenness of it that told her everything. "I am not asking you to be unfair to Thomas," he said. "I would not ask that. I know what he was to you. I know it has not been long enough. But I want you to know that I am not going anywhere. I am not going to leave with the spring drive or get restless and move on. I am done moving, Ada, if you will have me here." The lamp between them was low and gold, and outside the Kansas winter pressed on the windows, and Ellie breathed steadily in the next room, and Ada Cooper looked at Luke Redmond and felt the stone she had been carrying in her chest shift and lift, and for the first time in 10 months put itself down. "I would have you here," she said. "When the time is right." "When the time is right," he agreed. They looked at each other across the table, and the understanding between them was clear and complete and unhurried, and it was perhaps the most intimate thing that had passed between them yet. He rode back to the Elbert place that evening, because there was no cause not to, and Ada sat by the stove with her mending and did not feel alone at all. February was cold but bearable. Ellie recovered from her chest cold and went back to school and came home every day with a detailed account of the day's events that she delivered directly to Luke whenever he appeared, apparently having decided that he was the appropriate recipient for this information. He received it with the same serious attention he gave everything, and asked follow-up questions that made Ellie feel the gravity of each story had been fully appreciated, which was exactly what 5-year-olds require. The thaw came late that year, the true thaw, not until the first week of March. And when the ground softened and the creek ran high with meltwater, Ada found herself thinking about planting and fencing and the barn roof that also needed attention. And she realized she was thinking about these things with something she had not felt in a year: anticipation. The forward-looking energy of someone who has something to look forward to. She baked a pie on the first Saturday of March, apple from the dried store, and went to the Elbert Ranch herself and knocked on the front door, and Nora answered and looked at the pie, and then at Ada's face and smiled in the particular knowing way that Nora had made into an art form. "He is in the south pasture," Nora said. "I will send someone to fetch him." "You do not have to," Ada said. "I know," Nora said, and called to one of the Elbert boys to ride out and tell the new hand that Mrs. Cooper was here to see him. Ada sat in Nora's kitchen and drank tea and talked about spring planting while she waited, and when she heard Boots on the porch her heart did the thing it had been doing since Christmas morning. That particular loud and complicated thing that she had stopped pretending was something other than what it was. He came in with the sun behind him and stopped when he saw her at the table, and a warmth came across his face that was not quite the full smile but was everything around it. "Ada," he said. "I brought a pie," she said. "I thought it might be time for you to come to supper on a day that is not Sunday." He looked at her steadily, making sure he understood the proposition, and she could see him understanding it, and she met his gaze without flinching. "All right," he said. Nora examined her teacup with extreme interest. He came to supper on Tuesday and Thursday and the following Monday. And at some point in March, the Sunday formality dropped away, and he simply came when he was free and was welcomed when he arrived. And the distinction between visiting and belonging began to blur in a way that Ada found she did not want to clarify, because the blurring felt like the truth of it. On a warm evening in late March, when the stars were out and Ellie had been in bed for an hour and the last of the day's warmth still rose from the porch boards, Luke and Ada sat side by side on the porch steps, and Ada leaned her head against his shoulder, and he went very still and then very slowly put his arm around her, and they sat like that for a long time listening to the prairie breathe. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask it properly," he said. "When the time is right." She understood him. She tilted her head and looked up at him in the starlight and said, "The time is getting there." He turned his head and looked down at her, and he was close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes clearly even in the dark, and he said, "Ada." Just her name, but the way he said it, as if it were an answer to a question he had been asking for a very long time. "Luke," she said just as quietly. He kissed her. Gently, without hurry, with the same care and deliberateness he brought to everything, and it was the first time she had been kissed in more than a year, and she felt it in every part of herself. She kissed him back with the full force of all the months of knowing and waiting and not quite reaching, and when they pulled back and looked at each other in the dark, there was nothing left to wonder about. He stayed on the porch for another hour and then rode back to the Elbert place, but before he went he held her hand for a moment at the foot of the steps and said, "I am going to ask Sam Elbert about land." Ada looked at him. "There is a parcel south of his property," he said. "He mentioned in January it might be for sale, 40 acres. It has a creek and good grass." "That is a large undertaking," Ada said. "Yes," he said. She understood that he was not just talking about land. He was talking about setting down roots in this particular soil, this particular place. He was talking about the 40 acres as a beginning. He looked at her steadily and she looked back at him and she said, "The time is getting there, Luke." And he nodded once and kissed her forehead and got on his horse and rode into the dark. The spring moved quickly after that. Luke negotiated with Sam Elbert and found that the parcel south of the Elbert spread could be had for $240, which was the full of his savings plus a promissory note to Sam that he would repay over 3 years' work, which Sam accepted because Nora had advised him to, and because Luke Redmond was the kind of man you offered credit to without losing sleep over it. He filed the land claim at the county office in April and began building a house on it in May. Working evenings and Sundays with timber, he milled himself and cottonwood posts he cut from along the creek. Sam Elbert's two older boys helped, and old Cal Briggs came out twice despite his bad back to advise on foundation work, and even the preacher came one Sunday in June and handed boards and nailed things, and was more useful than anyone had expected. Ada brought food to the building site on Saturday afternoons, cold chicken and bread and pie, packed in a basket that she and Ellie carried together across the 2 miles of prairie between her homestead and Luke's 40 acres. Ellie had developed a proprietary interest in the building of the house and offered detailed architectural suggestions that were received with more seriousness than they perhaps merited. "The window should be bigger," Ellie announced on a Saturday in June, standing in what would be the kitchen and squinting at the framed opening, "so the morning light comes in." Luke looked at the window frame, then at Ada. Ada raised her eyebrows at him. "I can make it bigger," he said. "You do not have to do that," Ada said. "I know that," he said. He made the window bigger. It let in a remarkable amount of morning light, and Ada stood in the kitchen frame on the Saturday he finished it and looked at the light falling across the rough-cut floor, and felt a surge of feeling so large and various she could not name all the parts of it. Joy was in there. Grief was in there, because Thomas was not here to see this, and she was building something new on the site of what had been lost, and that was both right and hard, and she was learning to hold both things at once. Hope was in there, large and clear, and no longer the tentative direction of something but the thing itself. On the 1st of August, on a clear warm morning when the Kansas sky was the color of a blue bird's wing, and the grass was high and gold all the way to the horizon, Luke Redmond asked Ada Cooper to marry him. He did it on the porch of her house, Thomas's house, which she was keeping and would keep, which they had discussed, because she was not prepared to leave it and he would never ask her to. And he did it in the morning when Ellie was home, because he had decided some time ago that Ellie's opinion was relevant and her presence appropriate. He had brought her flowers, which surprised her, a bundle of prairie wildflowers, yellow and purple and white, the kind that grew along the creek and that she had always loved, and he handed them to her, and then he looked at her and then at Ellie, who was sitting on the top porch step watching with an expression of intense anticipatory concentration, and he said, "Ellie, I am going to ask your mother something important. I want you to know that it includes you." Ellie nodded gravely. She had, Ada suspected, been expecting this for some time. Luke looked at Ada. "I know what this is asking," he said. "I know it is not a simple thing. I know you love Thomas, and I am not asking you to stop or to put that somewhere smaller. I am asking if there is room in your life for me alongside all of that. I am asking if you will let me build beside you, not over anything you have already built." He paused. "I am asking if you will marry me, Ada." Ada had not expected to cry. She had thought she was past the kind of crying that surprised her. But something about the way he said it, the care in it, the recognition of the full complexity of what he was asking, the acknowledgement that this was not a replacement but an addition, broke something loose in her chest that she had not known was still held rigid. She said yes, while her eyes were wet, and then she said, "Yes, Luke, I will marry you." He exhaled a long, slow breath, and she realized he had been afraid she would say no, which she found unbearably dear, this careful, confident man who fixed things without being asked and had been afraid she would say no. Ellie said, "Good," in a tone of satisfaction, and stood up and hugged them both. They were married in September, 1 year and 6 months after Thomas Cooper was buried on the ridge above the creek, at a ceremony in the Millhaven church that Nora Elbert had organized with the efficiency of a military campaign and the warmth of someone who was genuinely overjoyed. Ada wore a dress made from the blue wool Luke had brought her at Christmas. She had made it herself over the spring and summer, stitch by careful stitch, and she carried the prairie wildflowers, dried and tied with a ribbon Ellie had chosen. Luke stood at the front of the church in a good coat and clean trousers, and looked at Ada coming up the aisle with an expression that was not quite the full smile, but was everything around it and more. and Ada walked toward him on a September morning in 1875, with the light coming through the church windows and her daughter beside her and her whole future in front of her and her past held carefully in her chest like the thing it was, real and loved and not forgotten, and not the end of the story. They said their vows simply, without flourish. The preacher was thorough. Nora cried. Sam Elbert stood with his arms crossed and a suspicious brightness in his eyes that he clearly felt was unsuitable and was losing the battle with. Ellie stood between her mother and Luke and held both their hands and looked up at the proceedings with the expression of someone presiding over an event they have personally arranged. Afterward, there was a celebration at the Elbert Ranch that lasted the better part of the afternoon and involved more food than Ada had ever seen assembled in one place on the Kansas plains, and music from a fiddle player named Pete who had a bad ear for pitch but an excellent ear for tempo, and dancing on the packed earth of Sam's yard, while the September sun went down in colors that only the prairie knows. Luke danced with Ada, which she had not known he could do, and he was not a great dancer, but he was steady and sure, the way he was steady and sure about everything. And she laughed in the full way she had not laughed in over a year, her head back and her whole chest open, and he watched her laugh with that warm, particular look. And then he laughed too, at himself, at the dancing, at all of it. And she realized it was the first time she had seen him laugh without reservation, and it was one of the best things she had ever seen. Ellie fell asleep against old Cal Briggs's knee at 7 in the evening and had to be carried to the Elbert house by her new stepfather, which she did not stir for, being the kind of child who slept with total conviction once committed to it. Luke carried her carefully, and Ada watched him and felt the particular tender weight of that picture, her daughter asleep in this man's arms, and tucked it away with all the other pictures she was collecting of this life she was choosing. They went home that night, which was Ada's house until Luke's house was finished, which they had agreed was the sensible arrangement, and Ellie was settled into her bed still in her Sunday dress with her shoes still on, because neither of them had the heart to wake her. And Luke and Ada sat on the porch in the September night with the stars out in their full autumn array, and Ada leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way for a long time without speaking. "Are you happy?" he said finally. "Yes," Ada said, not reflexively but genuinely in the considered way she gave answers to things that mattered. "Yes, Luke, I am very happy." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. She felt his exhale, slow and settled, the exhale of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and put his pack down. The autumn that followed their marriage was different from the autumn before it, not because the work was less. It was always the same work, the splitting and the stacking and the putting by and the winterizing, but because there were two of them doing it, the weight of it divided differently. Luke had taken up the work of Ada's homestead alongside the continued management of his 40 acres, where the house was finished and the small barn stood ready, and they had decided together that they would rent the 40 acres for grazing to Sam Elbert while they continued to live at Ada's place, which made practical sense, and paid the promissory note down faster. Millhaven had nothing to say against them that was unkind, or rather, what few unkind things there were to say were said by people who made it their business to find unkindness in every arrangement, and Ada had lived here long enough to know which opinions to take seriously and which to let the wind carry away. Nora Elbert declared Ada's remarriage to be exactly right, which in Millhaven carried sufficient social weight to end the matter. Ellie adapted to the change with a 5-year-old's pragmatic speed. Luke was a known quantity by now, a fixture, someone who had been fixing her world for months, and the addition of the word stepfather to the list of things he was seemed to her less a change than a clarification. She called him Luke. She did not call him father, because Thomas was her father and she was old enough to hold that, and Luke had never suggested or asked for anything different, which Ada thought was one of the clearest indicators of his character she had seen. But on a Saturday morning in November, 4 months after the wedding, Ellie came into the kitchen where Luke was helping Ada with the breakfast dishes and stood at his elbow and said, "Luke, can I call you Papa sometimes?" The dish in Luke's hands went still. "Not instead of my real Papa," Ellie said, with the careful precision of a child who has thought about this extensively. "I know my real Papa is Thomas, but you are also my Papa, so I could call you both." Luke set the dish down and crouched to her level, and Ada, watching from across the kitchen, saw something pass through his face that was almost too large for it, a feeling that moved across his expression like weather across the open sky. "I would be very honored," he said, "if you called me Papa sometimes." Ellie nodded, satisfied with this arrangement, and went back to her room to find her carved horse, and Luke stayed crouched by the kitchen floor for a moment longer. And Ada came and put her hand on his shoulder and felt the tension in it, the held feeling, the largeness of what he was not quite expressing. And she said nothing because she understood that some things do not need words to be fully communicated. He stood and turned, and she saw his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, and she put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back with a firmness that said everything. In January of 1876, Ada realized she was expecting a child. She told Luke on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table with Ellie still asleep, the winter light thin and clean through the kitchen window, and she said it plainly because she had no other way of saying things. He looked at her across the table. The expression that came across his face was the slow-building kind, starting in the eyes and spreading, and it was the full smile, the one that had first appeared on Christmas Eve and that she had been collecting ever since, all the variants of it, the small ones and the almost ones, and now this one, which was the largest she had seen. "Ada," he said, which was all he said for a moment, and it was enough. "August, I think," she said. He stood from the table and came around it, and she stood to meet him, and he held her face in his hands and looked at her as if she were the prairie sky and the morning and the whole of the open world, and then he kissed her with a thoroughness that she felt in the soles of her feet. "A baby," he said, against her hair. "A baby," she agreed. He sat back down and then stood up again immediately because he was too much to contain in a sitting position, and Ada laughed at him, and he looked at her laughing at him, and then he laughed too, and they were still laughing when Ellie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown asking what was funny. Ada looked at Luke. Luke looked at Ada. "We have some news," Ada said. Ellie's expression went thoughtful. "Am I getting a brother or a sister?" "We do not know yet," Ada said. "Babies take a long time," Ellie observed. "Miss Harmon at school had a baby last spring and she was very round for ages first." "That is accurate," Ada said. Ellie considered. "I would like a brother," she said. "I know many girls already. I do not know any brothers." Luke and Ada exchanged a look over her head. The spring came early in 1876, which Kansas offered as a gift when it felt like it. The creek ran high and musical, and the grass came green and thick across the prairie, and the garden went in with the full optimism of a new season. Ada tended the garden with more determination than caution, because she was not an invalid, and Luke built a new fence around the garden because the old one had been leaning since fall, and they worked in the warm April evening side by side, while Ellie ran the length of the yard and came back breathless with the findings of her expeditions. Ada's condition progressed without drama, which she was grateful for, having heard enough horror stories from other women to know what could go wrong. She was healthy and the baby was active, and Nora Elbert, who had 4 of her own, came to sit with her monthly and offer the kind of practical wisdom that doctors rarely possessed, and women always did. "You look well," Nora said in June, looking Ada over with the clinical eye of a woman who had seen the full range of these things. "Strong, the baby is sitting well." "It kicks," Ada said with a rueful fondness. "Good," Nora said. "Strong kick means strong child." Luke had finished the second bedroom on the 40-acre house in May, and they had been discussing the logistics of moving there before the baby came, but the distance from town, the distance from the school, and Ada's attachment to the house she had kept, the house where Thomas had lived, and where she had sat through those 7 hard months keeping herself whole, made the decision less simple than square footage. One evening in June, Luke raised the matter directly. "Tell me what you want," he said. Not what was practical, not what made sense, just what she wanted. Ada thought about it honestly. "I want both of them," she said. He looked at her. "I know that is not an answer," she said, "but it is the truth. I want this house because of what it is. I want yours because of what it means." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if we keep this one for now, until Ellie is through school? And then we decide. And your 40 acres. The grazing rent from Sam covers the note," he said. "There is no rush. Land waits." Ada looked at him across the kitchen table in the June evening, this man who made his decisions the way he made everything carefully, with consideration for what she needed alongside what he needed, and she thought, "I love him," not for the first time. She had been thinking it since Christmas morning 2 years ago. But every time she thought it, the thought was bigger than the last time, as if the word grew to fit the space he kept opening up. "That is a good plan," she said. "It is your plan," he said. "I am just agreeing with it." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught. The summer of 1876 was hot and brilliant, and Ada spent most of it large with child, and managing the garden and the household and the farm in the way she had always done, which was by doing whatever needed doing and refusing to be treated as though she were made of china. Luke watched her from a careful distance and occasionally made suggestions that she sometimes took and sometimes did not, and he had learned by now which battles were worth picking and which were not, and the ones that were not were, in his assessment, most of them. On the 14th of August, in the full heat of a Kansas summer, their son was born. The labor was hard but not long, and Nora Elbert was there from the beginning, steady and competent, and the Millhaven doctor, a young man named Patterson who had arrived from Ohio 6 months ago and was still slightly overwhelmed by the West but good at his job, was there when he was needed. Luke sat on the porch through all of it because there was nowhere else to put him, and he would not go further than the porch. Ellie was at the Elbert Ranch for the day. The baby announced himself with a force and volume that traveled clearly through the wall, and Luke stood up from the porch steps so fast he knocked over the bucket he had been sitting beside, and the water went everywhere, and he did not care at all. Nora appeared at the door 5 minutes later with her sleeves rolled up and the expression of someone who has done this many times and finds it no less marvelous for that. "You have a son," she said, "and Ada as well. Come in." He came in. Ada was sitting up in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she looked exhausted in the way of someone who has done something enormous, and her hair was loose and damp, and she was looking at the bundle in her arms with an expression Luke had never seen on her face before, which was not different from the love she had for Ellie but was the first sight version of it, raw and absolute, and it made his chest ache. She looked up when he came in, and the expression widened to include him, and she said, "Come here," and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms. He held him. The baby was very new and very small and very alarmed by the world in the way that all new people are, and he was squinting with the effort of existing, and his hands were clenched in tiny fists, and he had a full head of dark hair already, and Luke held him with the careful, deliberate attention he gave to fragile things and felt the room tip on its axis. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. "I am your father." The baby did not respond to this but opened his eyes briefly and looked in Luke's approximate direction with the unfocused gaze of the newborn, and this was entirely sufficient. "What shall we call him?" Ada said. Luke looked at her. They had discussed names without deciding. "Whatever you think is right," he said. Ada looked at the baby in Luke's arms. She had thought about this. She had thought about the names she and Thomas had discussed, and the name she loved, and the name that felt true for this child, this son of hers and Luke's, born in the heat of August in Kansas in a house that had held grief and was now holding this. "James," she said, "for my father, and his middle name can be Thomas if you are willing." Luke looked at her steadily. He knew what she was asking. He knew what it meant to give this child Thomas's name. Not as a primary name, not as a replacement, but as a middle name, a carried name, a thread of continuity through the life of a child who would grow up knowing the full story of his family, the living and the dead and the new. He knew what it meant that she was asking him if he was willing, acknowledging that it was his choice too. James Thomas Redmond, he said. That is a good name. Ada's eyes went bright. She reached out and put her hand on top of Luke's, the one that was holding their son, and they sat like that, the three of them, the new triangle of their family, in the late afternoon heat of August, while the prairie stretched gold and endless outside the window, and the world arranged itself into the shape it was meant to be. They brought Ellie home the next morning, and she came into the room with a controlled seriousness that lasted approximately until she saw the baby, at which point the seriousness dissolved into something pure and unmanageable. She climbed onto the bed beside Ada and looked at James Thomas Redmond with enormous brown eyes. "He is very small," she whispered. "He will get bigger," Ada said. "He has hair," Ellie observed with the tone of someone surprised by this. "I thought babies were bald." "Some are," Ada said. "This one was not." Ellie extended one careful finger and James gripped it with the reflexive grip of newborns, the grip that makes the world suddenly make a different kind of sense, and Ellie went entirely still and looked at Ada and then at Luke with an expression of pure wonder. "He is holding my hand," she breathed. "He is," Luke said. Ellie looked back at the baby with the expression of someone making a decision. "Hello, James," she said very gently. "I am Ellie. I am your sister. I will show you everything." The years that followed were the years of a life being built, which is to say they were full of work and difficulty and joy in approximately equal measures, and the difficulty and the joy were often the same thing viewed from different distances. James grew as children grow, with a speed that continually surprised Ada and a personality that emerged early and fully. He was a serious, curious child with his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, the kind of small person who asked questions until he had the answer, and then went very quiet thinking about the answer. He followed Luke everywhere from the time he could walk, with the purposeful toddling of a child who has important places to be, and Luke bore this escort with a patience and delight that Ada watched from the kitchen window and the garden and the porch, and stored with all the other things she collected. Ellie went from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8 with the momentum of a child who is paying close attention to the world and has opinions about everything she finds there. She was smart in the way that exceeded her schooling, and Ada had begun to think seriously about what came after the Millhaven schoolhouse, which only went to the 6th grade, because Ellie was going to need more than the 6th grade. This was a conversation for the future, but Ada was a woman who thought ahead. The 40 acres remained in grazing lease to Sam Elbert, and the Redmonds remained in Ada's house. And in the summer of 1879, Luke built a second room onto the back of the house without asking Ada, because she had mentioned once in passing that she had always wished for a proper sitting room, and he remembered it, and built it while she was at the quilting circle with Nora. And when she came home and found him putting the last of the window trim up, she stood in the doorway of the new room with her hands over her mouth. "You cannot keep doing things like this," she said, which was not what she meant at all. "Doing things like what?" he said. "You know what," she said. He climbed down from the step stool and came to her, and she walked into his arms and he held her, and she said into the leather of his coat, "I love you, Luke Redmond, enormously." "I know," he said. "I love you too, enormously." James, who was 3 years old, appeared from the kitchen with a biscuit in his hand and looked at his parents embracing in the doorway of the new room and said, in the tone of scientific inquiry, "What are you doing?" "Your father built us a new room," Ada said. James looked at the room. He walked into it and stood in the middle of it and looked at the ceiling and then at the window and then at the light coming through it. He turned around once. "It is good," he pronounced and went back to his biscuit. Luke and Ada looked at each other. "High praise," Luke said. "He has very good taste," Ada said. On the occasion of Ellie's 10th birthday, in the spring of 1880, Luke and Ada gave her a real book, not a school primer but an actual novel, one of the Jane Austen novels that Ada had loved before she came west and had kept in a box under the bed for years. The kind of book that had survived the crossing and the years because Ada would not let it go. They gave her this and a composition book with a good leather cover for her to write in, because Ellie had started writing things down, observations, stories, descriptions of the prairie and the people in it. And Ada recognized this as the beginning of something important and wanted to honor it. Ellie received both gifts with the solemnity she gave to things that mattered, and then she said, "When I am grown up, I want to be a writer." "Then you will be one," Ada said. "It is not easy," Ellie said, with the precocious seriousness of a 10-year-old who has already made up her mind. "Most things worth doing are not easy," Luke said. "You know that better than most." Ellie looked at him. She had grown taller in the past year, and the babyishness had gone from her face entirely, leaving behind something that was entirely its own, her father's nose and her mother's eyes, and something in the expression that was entirely Ellie. "You think I can do it," she said. "I think you can do most things you decide to do," Luke said. "And I think you will decide to do a great many things." Ellie smiled at him, the smile that was full and certain in his, that he had earned completely in the years since he had first crouched on a wet roof and fixed shingles in the rain, and said, "Thank you, Papa." She had been calling him Papa for years by then, as naturally as breathing, alongside the careful keeping of Thomas in her memory. The stories Ada told and the photographs she kept, and the way she spoke of Thomas as her father with the clear-eyed honesty of a child who knows the whole truth and is not diminished by it but made larger. Ada was expecting again by the summer of 1880, and James was delighted with this information in the proprietary way of a child who expects to be excellent at brotherhood, and Ellie was matter-of-fact about it in the way of someone who has been through a version of this already and knows the general shape of events. The second baby arrived in the January of 1881, a girl this time, Clara, they called her, for Ada's mother, with Ruth as her middle name because Luke had had a grandmother named Ruth he had loved. Clara Ada Ruth Redmond came into the world in the depths of a Kansas winter, with considerably less drama than her brother had and more volume than seemed possible from something so small. And she was a golden-haired person from her first hours, which surprised everyone because nobody on either side had been particularly golden-haired. "She looks like your grandmother," Luke told Ada, who had shown him the only photograph she had of her grandmother, a stern-faced woman in a formal portrait who had, according to Ada, been secretly hilarious and made the best apple cake in 3 counties. "Let us hope she has her nature," Ada said, "and not her expression in formal portraits." Clara grew into both, as it turned out, the humor and the intensity in equal measure, in a combination that made her, by the age of 3, simultaneously the funniest and most maddening person in the Redmond household, which was saying something. The Millhaven of the early 1880s was not the same Millhaven Ada had arrived at in 1869 with Thomas and their young hopes. It had grown not greatly, but noticeably. There was a proper schoolhouse now, and a doctor's office, and a land office, and a new church with glass windows rather than plain ones, and 3 more homesteads along the eastern ridge where there had been 2. The railroad had come within 20 miles, and this changed things in the way the railroad always changed things, brought goods and people and news, and a sense of the larger world pressing closer. It also brought trouble sometimes. 1882 saw a difficult season of cattle disputes between the northern ranchers and the newer settlers moving onto land that the ranchers had been using unfenced for years. And there were hard words and harder feelings, and one incident at the edge of Sam Elbert's property that involved a confrontation and a gun that had, by everyone's agreement, come too close to a worse outcome. Luke had been involved in talking that particular situation down. He was a man with the kind of calm authority that made people in heated moments listen to him, and he had spoken to both sides with the same steady directness he brought to everything, and the outcome had been a grudging agreement and not a burial, which Ada was grateful for beyond measure. She had not realized, until he rode home that evening and she saw his face and understood how close it had been to something unrecoverable, how thoroughly her life had reorganized itself around this man. Not how much she depended on him. Ada Cooper Redmond did not easily depend on anyone, but how much she was bound to him, how deeply woven into the texture of her existence he had become, so that the thought of his absence was not just a sadness but a structural impossibility. She had said nothing dramatic when he came in. She had poured him water and sat across from him while he drank it, and then she had said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. "The situation." "Resolved," he said. For now is enough," she said. He looked at her across the table. "I was thinking of you," he said, "out there, when it was at its worst. I was thinking, Ada is at home. The children are with Ada. There is no version of this that ends badly for me because there are too many things worth coming home to." Ada looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You infuriating man. You cannot say things like that and expect me to behave normally after." He almost smiled. "You are always the most normal person in any room you are in," he said. "That is not true at all," Ada said, and he did smile then fully, and she was so glad he was here and whole and at her table that she reached across and took his hand and held it. In the spring of 1883, Ellie turned 13, and the Millhaven schoolhouse ran out of things to teach her. Ada had been thinking about this for 3 years. She had written letters to the county seat, to the state education office, to a women's college in Lawrence that had been established in 1876, and that Ada had read about in a newspaper Nora Elbert had brought back from Wichita. The Lawrence College was not an option for another 5 years, but there was a secondary school in Dodge City that boarded students and had a reputation that Ada had researched with her usual thoroughness, and it was 40 miles away, which was far, and it cost money they would have to stretch to, and Ellie would have to leave home for the first time. Ada brought this to the family table in April with the prospectus spread out and Ellie sitting across from her with a serious expression and Luke beside Ada where he sat. "I want to go," Ellie said before Ada had finished explaining. "I know," Ada said. "Is it too much?" Ellie said, meaning the money. "We will manage," Luke said. He looked at Ada and she looked back at him, and the look contained the full conversation they had already had about this. The stretching, the plan, the cutting here and adding there, the grazing revenue from the 40 acres that had been quietly reliable for 9 years and would cover most of it. "I do not want to be a burden," Ellie said, with the particular fierceness of a 13-year-old who already has a sense of how the world works and wants very badly not to require too much from it. "You are not a burden," Ada said firmly. "You are our daughter, and you are going to that school." Ellie looked at Luke. "Papa," she said. "Your mother is right," he said. "And besides, who is going to write about the world if you do not go learn it properly?" Ellie's jaw set in that way it had, the way Ada recognized as her own jaw setting, and she said, "All right, I will work twice as hard as anyone there." "I have no doubt," Ada said. Ellie went to Dodge City in September of 1883, and Ada stood on the platform of the Millhaven depot with James and Clara and Luke, watching the wagon that carried Ellie grow small on the South Road, and she felt the leaving of it in her chest, not grief, but the specific bittersweet weight of a child going forward, which is what you raise them to do, and which does not make the doing of it comfortable. Luke put his arm around her on the platform without speaking. James, who was 7 and had not entirely grasped the emotional content of the moment, said, "Can I have Ellie's biscuit at supper?" And Ada laughed despite herself, which was clearly the intended effect because James had his father's understanding of when laughter was the right medicine. The years settled into their rhythm. Ellie wrote home once a week long, vivid letters full of the Dodge City School and her teachers and the other girls, and the books she was reading and the stories she was beginning to write in earnest. And Luke read these letters at the supper table in the winter evenings, while James and Clara ate and Ada sewed, and the stove burned, and the house was full of the particular warmth of a family in its proper configuration. James grew into a quiet, industrious boy who loved the land the way his father loved it, practically, without sentimentality, with the kind of respect that comes from working with something difficult for long enough that you understand it on its own terms. By the time he was 10, he was helping Luke with the 40 acres in earnest, learning the fence and the soil, and the way to read the sky for weather with the patient instruction that Luke offered everything. Clara was a force entirely her own. She was the kind of child who had opinions about things before she had a full vocabulary to express them, and who compensated for the vocabulary gap with volume and eye contact. She adored James and terrified him in equal measure, and she adored Ellie with a distant, letter-mediated adoration that made Ellie's visits home into events of almost embarrassing emotional magnitude for Clara, who clung to her sister with the intensity of someone making up for lost time. She adored Ada and Luke with the open, uncomplicated love of a child who has never known anything but safety. And this uncomplicated love from this small, golden-haired person was something that Luke held carefully, privately, in the deepest part of himself. He had come to Millhaven with nothing but a horse and his work, and the need for a different direction, and he had found this. This family, this house, this woman who had handed him a hammer on a rainy roof and built something with him that was larger and more solid than anything he could have built alone. In the autumn of 1884, Ellie came home from Dodge City for the harvest break, and she had grown 3 inches and her handwriting had gotten better, and she had opinions about Emily Dickinson that she was willing to defend at length. And she sat at the table one evening after supper when the younger children were in bed and showed Ada and Luke the story she had written. A long story, 12 pages in her careful script. About a woman who homesteads alone on the Kansas plains after her husband dies and learns the specific grammar of survival. Ada read it slowly at the table, with Luke reading over her shoulder. It was very good, genuinely, unmistakably good, with the quality of observation and the clean, clear language of someone who was learning to say exactly what they meant. When Ada finished reading, she sat with her hands flat on the last page for a moment. She looked at Ellie. "This is me," she said. Ellie looked back at her steadily. "It is also not you," she said. "It is a character, but yes, I was thinking of you." "She is alone at the end," Ada said. "That is how the story goes," Ellie said. "The one I am writing now has someone who comes along." A pause. "The character finds someone," she added, not looking at Luke. Luke said from over Ada's shoulder very quietly, "That is a better ending." Ellie smiled, and it was her father's smile, Thomas's smile, which Ada still knew, and which appeared on Ellie's face sometimes like a gift, and it was also entirely Ellie's own. "I thought so too," she said. Ada set her hand on top of Ellie's on the table and squeezed, and Ellie squeezed back. And they sat like that for a moment while the October night pressed on the windows and the stove ticked, and the house held them the way good houses do, not just walls and beams, but all the years of living sedimented into the very structure of the place. By the spring of 1885, Ellie finished her coursework at the Dodge City School and came home with a certificate and a recommendation letter from her teacher and an intention to write, which she pursued by submitting stories to the Kansas newspaper in Topeka and the Wichita Daily. And she was rejected 4 times and accepted on the 5th, and then accepted again and then again. And by the time she was 16, she was being published regularly under the name E.A. Cooper, because she had thought carefully about what name to publish under and decided that Cooper was her name too, one of them, and she would keep it. James, at 9, declared that he intended to farm the 40 acres when he was grown, which Luke received with a quiet pleasure that he managed not to let become too visible, knowing that 9-year-old declarations are provisional. But James was, at 9, the kind of person whose declarations turned out to be accurate, and Luke thought privately that his son might actually mean it. Clara, at 4, declared that she intended to be a horse, which the family received with the respect it deserved. The homestead on the ridge had new paint on the shutters blue, Ada's choice, and the garden had expanded over the years to include herbs and flowers alongside the vegetables, because Ada had decided at some point that beauty was as necessary as sustenance, and acted accordingly. The sitting room Luke had built in 1879 was full of books and Ellie's published stories pinned to the wall, and Clara's drawings and James's school papers, and the carved horse on the windowsill, 10 years old now and worn smooth with Ellie's handling of it over the years. Luke had made Clara a carved bear the year she was born, and James had a carved hawk that he had asked for specifically at the age of 5, and that lived on the shelf above his bed. Luke's hands were older than they had been when he climbed that roof. There were more lines on his face, more gray in his hair. He was 40 now in 1885, and he wore it the way he wore everything, without complaint. Ada was 39. She was still the most direct person in any room she entered. She still said what she meant and meant what she said, and she still looked at the world with the clear-eyed assessment that had sized him up on that rainy morning 11 years ago and decided he was worth trusting with a hammer. He loved her more at 40 than he had at 30. This surprised him sometimes, the way love grew instead of settling, the way he found new dimensions of it in new situations. The way he loved her when she stood up at the town meeting and said something the majority did not want to hear and said it without flinching. The way he loved her when she sang to Clara at night badly because she could not carry a tune and did not care. The way he loved her when she sat at the kitchen table with a problem, a farm problem, a money problem, a child problem, and worked through it with methodical intelligence until she had the answer. He had told her this once, that he loved her more than he had before, and she had said, "Is that possible? I thought love was supposed to peak." And he had said, "I do not think love works that way." And she had said, "Neither do I actually." And they had looked at each other across the table with the full weight of 11 years between them, and it had been one of the best moments of his life, which was a life that had contained a great many good moments once he stopped moving and put his pack down. In the fall of 1885, Ellie announced she had been offered a position at the Topeka newspaper as a contributing writer, a paid position, a real one, and would be moving to Topeka in January. The family celebrated this over a supper that went on longer than usual, with Ellie at the center of it, bright and certain and entirely herself. "I am going to write a book," she said over the dessert, "a real one, a whole book about Kansas, about the people who came here and what they built." "Including your family," Ada said. Ellie looked at her mother. The look was full of something complicated and clear all at once. "Especially my family," she said. Ada held this. She thought about Thomas, who was in the story and who was loved and who was gone, and Luke, who was in the story and who was here and who was loved, and herself, who was in the story and who was still here and still building. 11 years on from the first time she had climbed up on a wet roof with a hammer she barely knew how to hold. She thought about all of it, and she thought, "Look at this. Look at what has been built." Luke caught her eye across the table. He had always been able to read her, this man, from the very first day, had looked at her on the roof in the rain and seen the loneliness and the determination, and had not left without doing something about both. He looked at her now across the supper table, with the lamplight warm between them and the children around them, and the full life of them accumulated in the walls of this house. And the expression on his face was the one she had been collecting for 11 years, the one that was warm and certain and entirely his. She looked back at him and she felt the old stone, the one she had carried since March of 1874, that had shifted and lifted and finally, fully put itself down, and she felt the absence of it as the presence of something else, something she could not name except in the general terms of fullness, of sufficiency, of a life that had held loss and come through it to this table, this supper, this husband, these children, this house. To this prairie that she had been afraid of and had chosen anyway, that had taken and given in equal measure, that had made her into exactly who she was. The November wind came off the plains, and the stove burned clean, and James said something that made Clara laugh so hard she nearly fell off her chair. And Ellie was writing something down in her composition book. Always writing, always paying attention. And Luke reached across the corner of the table and took Ada's hand, and she held it. Outside, the Kansas sky was enormous and full of stars, and the grass moved in the cold wind, and the house on the ridge with its new blue shutters and its expanded garden and its repaired roof and its fixed steps stood solid and warm against the November dark, holding everything it had been asked to hold. It was a good life. It was hers. It was theirs. In the years that came after the years of Ellie's book being published in 1888 to genuine reception in the Kansas papers, the years of James taking over the management of the 40 acres at 17, with a seriousness and competence that should have surprised no one but still filled Luke with a pride he had no adequate words for. The years of Clara growing up golden and fierce, and deciding at 12 that she would not be a horse after all but would instead be a doctor, which nobody doubted for a moment. In all those years the house on the ridge remained what it had become, which was the center of things. Ada went gray at her temples in 1888 and refused to mind it, which was entirely in character. Luke's face had the weathered quality of men who have spent decades on the open plains, all depth and line, and it suited him. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed, the same porch where they had sat 11 years ago in the September dark after their wedding, and they talked or did not talk, and the prairie stretched out before them, and the life they had built was all around them. In the spring of 1890, Ada climbed onto the roof to check the shingles after the winter, because old habits die hard and she did not entirely trust anyone else's assessment of her roof, and Luke came out of the barn and looked up and said, "Ada," in the tone that meant he would prefer she not, and she said, "I am fine, Luke, I do this every year." And he stood below looking up at her with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has been having this conversation for 15 years, and has never yet won it and knows it. She found 2 shingles that needed replacing, which she reported from the roof, and he said, "Come down and I will fix them." And she said, "I can fix them myself." And he said, "I know that." And she came down anyway because she was 54, no 44. It was 1890, she was 44, and because she wanted to, and she handed him the hammer and watched him go up. And she stood on the porch below looking up at him on the roof of their house in the spring light, and she thought, "This is the whole story. He fixed the shingles. He came back down. He handed her the hammer. He looked at her in the spring afternoon with gray in his hair and lines in his face, and the same steady gray eyes that had looked up at her from the road below on an October morning 16 years ago. And she looked back at him, Ada Cooper Redmond, who had been afraid of this place and had chosen it, who had been afraid of this and had chosen it too, and who had found that the choosing of difficult things was, in the end, the whole of a life, the full weight and the full warmth of it. "The east corner still holds," he said. "It always does," she said. He smiled, and she smiled, and the Kansas spring came all around them, and the prairie was green and gold to the horizon, and somewhere in the house Clara was practicing a song badly on the small parlor organ they had bought the year before, and James was in the south field doing something competent with a fence post, and Ellie's last letter was on the kitchen table saying she was working on her second book, and the life, their life, the one neither of them had expected and both of them had built together, board by board and day by day and year by year, spread out before them as generous and full as the sky above the Kansas plains, which went on and on and on without limit.